probably maybe a fifth, so about 200, would have involved blunt force trauma instead of, for example, a firearm or something like that. And in those cases, and of course, yeah, okay, so all of those and other cases involving sharp force, homicides involving sharp force may have evidence of a struggle as well. So it's in the hundreds, yeah.
In your expert medical opinion, are Mr. O'Keefe's injuries consistent with a fight or a physical altercation?
In a general sense, they can be. They could be, yes. He had, I alluded to it just briefly before, but the head injury, the major head injury I've described, but he also had a laceration over his right eyelid. He had some scrape marks on his face. He also had some bruises on the back of his right hand, which that kind of injury on the hands can be what we call a defensive injury. In other words, an injury that occurs when you're protecting yourself and you're hit hit either with another fist or with a hard object, and you're protecting yourself. So I would say that some of these findings I've just mentioned are consistent with the possibility of a physical altercation. Yes.
Thank you. If I could have one moment.
Sure.
No further questions.
Okay, Mr. Lau?
Thank you. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Injuries that you were just testifying about with regard to Mr. O'Keefe, they were on his right knee, his right arm, as well as the back right side of his head. Is that correct?
Yes, I forgot to mention the knee, but yes, there were injuries in those places, yes.
And understandable, but this isn't an autopsy you performed yourself, correct?
I did not perform myself, no.
You never saw the body. You're looking at photographs and reports, correct?
Yeah, I'm going by the photographs and the autopsy report, yes.
And contained within the materials that you reviewed, did you ever look at Mr. O'Keefe's medical records from the Good Samaritan?
Look at whose medical records, Mr. O'Keefe's?
Yes.
I looked at the medical records from Good Samaritan Hospital, where he was pronounced dead, yes.
Okay, so you did look at those as well?
I did look at those, yeah. I thought I mentioned it earlier. Maybe I forgot.
Now, with regard to what you reviewed of Mr. O'Keefe's injuries, you saw no injuries to his left arm, correct?
To his left arm? No, I don't think so, no.
No injuries to his left leg, correct?
No. Mm-hmm.
Injuries to his torso that you saw?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
And no injuries to the back left side of his head, is that correct as well?
That's correct, yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, you indicated that you observed or reviewed the autopsy reports as well as autopsy photographs and the death certificate, correct?
I did, yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, do you agree with Dr. Scortibello's determination as to the cause of death being multiple blunt force type injuries in conjunction with hypothermia?
I do agree with her, yes. Mm-hmm.
And you reviewed also the neuropathology report by Dr. Stonebridge?
I did, yes. Mm-hmm.
And do you agree or concur with the findings of Dr. Stonebridge contained within that report?
Yes, there were photographs taken during the neuropathology examination, which were independent confirmation to me of the things described in the report. Yes.
Now, with regard to autopsies that you performed in the past, well, let me ask you this first. As far as the injuries that you observed in the photographs to Mr. O'Keefe's right arm, they were not the cause of Mr. O'Keefe's death, correct?
No, they were not.
With regard to autopsies that you performed in the past, in regard to there being some sort of animal involved, as you were testifying before, is it normal to see just injuries related to an animal attack on just one portion of one piece of body?
Yes, in a general way. I mean, as I mentioned, I think when I was answering the question about the cases I've done involving animals, I tried to divide them into two groups because there's an important difference. Some of those cases were cases where the animals were responsible for the death itself. As I said, a bunch of feral dogs in one case, particularly that I remember. Another was a case where it wasn't a whole bunch of them, but there were two dogs, large dogs, and they killed the victims' children. So those individuals had multiple injuries, including deep bite marks that were fatal, particularly in the neck area. But they also had, and I'm stretching my memory a bit because it's a while since I did these cases, but I do have a general recollection that in in those cases, I should say, in addition to the fatal injuries, there were also some non-fatal sort of things like paw marks. And I can't remember the distribution though on the body.
Can you remember as far as whether or not these injuries that you observed and not taking the child fatalities with the dog's mauled? I'm presuming that those involved injuries to significant and extensive parts of the body. Is that correct?
Yeah, those are the ones where the animals caused the death, yes.
So in the other instances that you were talking about, do you recall even whether or not those injuries that you observed were ante-mortem or post-mortem?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part.
The other ones that you were talking about as far as the other animal attacks that you've seen,
Yeah.
do you recall whether or not the injuries that you observed in those instances were ante-mortem or post-mortem?
Oh, ante-mortem. Well, actually, in one of the cases that comes to mind, the marks appeared to be post-mortem, and that was this person was actually a homicide victim, and they were lying outdoors, and their own dog. This was according to police, though, who came on the scene. When they arrived, there was a dog that turned out to be the victim's own dog, was pawing at the body, but the person was dead. But in another case that I can think of, the scratch marks from dog paws were ante-mortem, and they were confined to one place only. I'm trying to remember what part of the body. This case, I had to testify later on. In this case that I'm thinking of now, the paw marks were limited to just one location. I can't remember exactly where they were, though. Whether it was the leg or the arm, I can't remember.
And that was post-mortem injuries that you're talking about there, correct?
No, in the second case here, they were ante-mortem. So in other words, there's been post-mortem and ante-mortem. Yes.
The injuries that you observed on Mr. O'Keefe's arm were to the posterior part of his arm, correct?
Yes, basically the posterior.
No injuries that you observed on the anterior portion or the other side of the right arm, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
No other injuries that you observed consistent with what you're talking about as far as an animal attack on any other part of Mr. O'Keefe's body, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And from what you observed in the reports and the photographs, you can't say definitively what type of animal, correct?
That's correct. I can't.
And you can't say even if it was an animal or was a dog, what breed of dog that was. Is that correct?
No, but if I had to try, and if I said,
Not asking you to try, sir. I'm just asking whether or not you can say whether or not that what breed of dog it was.
no, I can't tell you what breed. No.
You can't say whether or not those injuries were inflicted inside a house or outside of a house. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have no idea. Mm-hmm.
You can't say when they occurred, correct?
Only that they were when he was still alive. Yeah, but other than that, no. And they are fresh looking. I mean, in this generally, so they look like they happened very shortly before death.
And when you say a short time, we're talking about hours,
Minutes to hours, I would say.
minutes to hours, but you can't.
I mean, I'm
confirm.
talking just based on the injuries themselves alone, leaving anything else out. You can't time injuries as exactly as you might think from CSI or one of these television programs, but they are generally fresh for sure. And but just looking at those on their own, I would have to say minutes to hours, yes.
Now, at some point, were you given or did you review any files from a lab at University of California, Davis?
I'm not sure in relation to what.
So are you aware that the State Police Lab in Massachusetts swabbed areas of the sleeve on the right arm of Mr. O'Keefe and sent samples from that in the areas of where the injuries occurred on his right arm, and then sent that to a lab at UC Davis? Are you aware of that?
I'm not sure that I remember that, no.
And so you're equally unaware then that when that was tested, there was no canine DNA found from any of those swabbings in the area where the injuries that you're describing as scratch marks or bite marks occurred.
I wasn't aware of that. I must have missed it.
Are you aware of any sort of bite history or a specific animal at 34 Fairview being involved in attacks on other dogs?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understood that question.
Were you aware that there was a dog that resided at 34 Fairview Road?
Am I aware that there was a dog there?
Yes.
I was informed there was, yes.
Were you also informed that that dog, months later, after January 2022, was involved in an incident in which it attacked another dog? Humans intervened, and one of the humans was bitten.
No, I didn't know that.
Were you aware that there were photographs of an actual bite mark from that actual dog months after January 29th? Were you shown any of that?
No, I don't believe I was.
Now, sir, did you write a report in relation to what you observed or anything in regard to your opinion or your testimony that you're testifying to here today?
I didn't write a report as such, but I signed a declaration early on in my involvement in this case.
And that was a declaration or an affidavit that you signed under the pains and penalties of perjury back on January 31st, 2023. Is that correct?
Sorry, what did you say about that?
When you're talking about a declaration, you're referring to an affidavit that you filed with the court under the pains and penalties of perjury in January of 2023.
I didn't think it was January, but however, there was only one, so whatever you have.
Now, at any point in time were you made aware that there were microscopic pieces of the defendant's tail light as small as 1/16 of an inch by 1/16 of an inch that were found in Mr. O'Keefe's clothing?
Objection.
I'll allow it.
That were found in Mr. O'Keefe's what?
Mr. O'Keefe's shirts.
I don't remember that specifically.
And that those pieces were then found to be consistent with the defendant's tail light.
Like I said, I don't remember that particular part.
Were you ever shown any material indicating that there was DNA from the defendant's taillight housing that was consistent with Mr. O'Keefe?
I asked about that myself, but I think the answer I got was no.
Now, were you ever told about a piece of human hair that was found on the right rear quarter panel near the area where there was a dent on the back right of the defendant's vehicle?
No, I don't remember that.
So then you weren't also told that that was then sent out for mitochondrial DNA testing and it was consistent with that of Mr. O'Keefe to a degree of 99.895%.
You talk about a hair sample now. Yeah. No, I didn't have that.
Now, doctor, would you agree that in blunt impact injuries, the characteristics of a blunt object can then be transferred to the victim in the form of pattern abrasions that match the characteristics of that blunt object?
Yes.
Now, of the photographs, you reviewed photographs of the scene, photographs of the vehicle, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
You're aware that there were a number of different pieces of the defendant's taillight that were photographed as well. Did you ever see those?
I did, yes.
you recall seeing any piece of a clear plastic taillight piece that was recovered on January 29th, along with Mr. O'Keefe's sneaker that had dimpling on the outside of that clear piece of plastic?
I can't. I remember seeing the pictures of the glass fragments, but I don't remember any more specifics than that.
Do you know what a compression abrasion is?
What?
Compression abrasion.
Yeah, although it's not a term we use all the time, but however, yes.
And a compression abrasion can occur when there's direct pressure from a blunt object together with slight rubbing movements that produce skin and epidermal crushing. Is that correct?
Yeah, you have to have some lateral movement as well, though, to get an abrasion.
Now, when you were talking about prior autopsies that you've done involving pedestrian collisions, is it fair to say that most of those pedestrian collisions that you were doing autopsies on involved pedestrians being struck by the front of the vehicle?
Yeah, mostly the front. Mhm.
So mostly it's a pedestrian sort of crossing the street or standing in the street who's then struck by the front of the vehicle, correct?
Yeah, I think they were all. I have actually done a couple of cases where children were hit by the back of a reversing vehicle. This was in the days before they had the rear videos on cars that they have now. But so those cases were impacts against the back of the vehicle. But most pedestrian cases, yeah, are, as you say, they're the front of the vehicle hitting the person.
Yeah, just briefly on that, as far as the defendant's vehicle itself, are you aware that there were rear backup cameras and a 360-degree overhead view from the back of her vehicle?
I remember reading that, yes. Mhm.
Now, understanding what you're talking about as far as a rear vehicle pedestrian collision, is that typically sort of the wear on the vehicle? Let me ask you this first. When you are doing an autopsy in relation to a pedestrian collision, much of the information that you're gaining about that is what you receive from the investigating agency, whether it's the police or something like that, correct?
It varies a lot from one case to another. Sometimes you get or virtually no information about the accident, because some of these cases I've done, some of them were witnessed, some weren't. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So when they weren't witnessed, and when the person was just found later or sometime afterwards, you wouldn't have necessarily any. The vehicle would typically not be there. These would be hit and run type situations. And so in those cases, you wouldn't have all that kind of information. So it varies. It varies.
And understanding that it varies, but primarily what I'm saying is whatever information as far as the body comes in and you're going to conduct an autopsy, there would be some information from law enforcement or witness statements or something as to what type of death this is, as far as gunshot wound, stabbing, pedestrian collision, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. But like I said, in those unwitnessed cases of pedestrians, I might be given the information that it's probably a pedestrian fatality from a car.
And when it comes to pedestrian collisions, and most of which that you've seen are, again, from the front of the vehicle striking a pedestrian in the roadway, is that correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And are you familiar with what role sort of the center of mass of that person versus the center of mass of where they're struck plays in reference to their injuries?
Yeah, it could be that can have a big effect on how the body reacts to the impact. Mm-hmm.
So most of the time when you're talking about sort of lower extremity injuries or pelvic fractures or things like that, that's in a frontal collision with the pedestrian, correct?
Most of them were, yeah. I mean, the ones that involved being backed over, and they were children. I can't remember the exact distribution of their injuries, except the vehicle went right over them. I do remember that. But anyway, the answer to your question, maybe I'm wandering in my mind. So can you ask me again?
I think you've answered it. So my next question, sir, is when it comes to the rear end collisions, primarily being children, you would agree with me that they have a lower center of mass than a 6'1", 200 something.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so as far as them being run over, they're going to get struck. They're probably going to fall to the ground, and then the vehicle is going to go over, correct?
That's right, yeah.
And so how many autopsies have you conducted in regard to pedestrian collisions where they've been sideswiped by the back of the vehicle?
I can't remember.
Can you remember any?
Not off the top of my head, no.
And so if someone is struck by the right rear portion of a vehicle and then projected away from the vehicle based on speed, based on force, based on whatever, would you then expect to see those same type of pelvic fractures or lower extremity injuries that you talked about with a frontal collision?
Well, it depends on the exact position of the victim at the moment of impact. And of course, it could be a lot of different things. They could be, the victim could be facing the vehicle, they could be sideways on, they could have their back. But you're going to see bruising somewhere in that area, in one of those areas, either on the back, the side, whatever, or the front. I would expect to see bruising, significant bruising.
But as you testified earlier on direct, it's sort of dependent or variable depending on how the victim pedestrian interacted with the vehicle. Isn't that correct?
Yes, but I'd expect bruising for sure. I mean, whether you get fractures and so forth will depend on, or for that matter, internal injuries, depends on a variety of factors. But you're going to get bruising for sure.
Now, you did see bruising on Mr. O'Keefe's right hand, correct?
Yes, a small bruising. It looked like two, possibly three, almost confluent or close together bruises.
Were you aware from the materials that you reviewed that Mr. O'Keefe was last seen sort of on video exiting from a bar at about 12:11 a.m. holding a cocktail glass in his right hand?
I vaguely remember that, yes.
Were you also aware that there were pieces of the cocktail glass with Mr. O'Keefe's DNA on it that were found right in the general vicinity of where his body was found?
That I don't remember.
You talked about a couple of different patterns to the injuries that you observed on Mr. O'Keefe's right arm. So my question for you, doctor, is it your testimony that those, what you're terming as animal bites or scratches, were they caused at one time or multiple times, or how many times are we talking about?
You mean on different occasions?
As far as in, there are multiple abrasions, as you've termed them, and you're attributing them to an animal attack, correct?
I think that's the most likely explanation for these, yes.
And so my question is, sir, is that from the dog or the animal or whatever it is scratching Mr. O'Keefe once, more than once, based on what you observed in
Well, it's more than once. When I had the laser pointer here, I think I pointed to roughly, 1, 2, 3, 4 different areas. So it looks like, and you have, maybe there's an additional, the ones on the lower forearm, I should say, are harder to figure out. But it looks like 4, maybe 5 separate.
4 or 5 separate sort of swipes, whether they be with mouth or claws or whatever.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so is it your testimony that it's not possible that Mr. O'Keefe received that from some part of the motor vehicle, or a glass shattering, or shattering from a taillight, or any sort of metal pieces underneath contained within that taillight housing as far as his interaction with the vehicle?
They don't look remotely like that to me.
So it's not possible, is that correct?
In my opinion, no.
You were asked about some questions with regard to the surface of the ground as far as dirt or grass. Are you familiar with what the weather was like at the time that Mr. O'Keefe, you testified earlier, you were familiar that he was found in the snow, correct?
Yes.
Do you know what the temperature was like as far as, my question is this, sir. Understanding cushioning of grass and dirt under normal conditions, but if the ground is physically frozen based on the temperature of outside, would that impact as far as your understanding of the injuries to the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head?
No, I mean, even if there was a small coating of ice, I wouldn't change my opinion based on that, no.
I'm not talking about ice, sir. What I'm talking about is the ground itself being physically frozen based on the temperatures outside.
Sustained.
Now, as far as the hard surface that you're talking about, would that include asphalt pavement?
Yes, it could.
And as far as those injuries, the speed, if Mr. O'Keefe was struck by a vehicle and was projected away from that vehicle and then struck his head on the ground, would that be sufficient force, in your opinion, to cause the skull fracture on the back of his head?
If all that happened, yes, and onto asphalt or something like asphalt, yes, if that's indeed what happened. But like for other reasons, I don't think that is what happened.
Now, you testified or you asked some questions about your opinion and as to or consistency with the physical altercation. Is that right?
Yes.
And the sort of swelling in Mr. O'Keefe's eyes, as far as the ecchymosis concerned there, that was related to the brain injury. Is that your understanding?
Well, the skull injury rather than the brain.
Skull
Yeah.
injury, which
Yeah.
leads to the bleeding of the brain, which then leads to the swelling of the eye.
Well, yeah, but no. I mean, let's be clear about this. I mentioned the fractures earlier on. It came from the back and went all the way towards the front of the skull, including what are called the orbital plates, which are the bones, the parts of the frontal bone that are right over the eye sockets. And the bone there is very delicate. It's the thinnest part of the skull. Anyway, the photographs and the autopsy report clearly show that the fracture involved that on each side, both orbital plates, in other words. And it's that fracture, it's not the brain itself, but it's that fracture which leads to the bleeding that causes the black eyes, if you want to call them that way.
And as far as what your review of the medical records, your review of the autopsy report, photographs, things like that, you observed nothing as far as fractures to Mr. O'Keefe's eye sockets, correct?
Well, the orbital plates, in a sense, are part of the eye sockets, but they're the roof.
Were there any fractures to the orbital bones?
There were no fractures that appeared to be coming from the front, no.
As far as the sclera, was there any broken blood vessels or anything that you observed in either the notes or the reports or the photographs or anything else that you saw?
Broken blood vessels were?
The sclera.
Huh?
Sclera of the eyes? You know what that is?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. Just couldn't hear what you said. Yeah. No, there just, as far as I know, the eyes were clear. Yeah. The eyes themselves were clear. Yeah.
Now, as far as the minor injuries that you were talking about, as far as the eyelid or the nose, as far as those minor lacerations you were talking about, there was no bruising around any of those lacerations, correct?
The eyelid laceration, don't forget, is in the same area where we have the other injury, and it's a little bit hard to figure out whether how much hemorrhage, how much of that black eye could even be related to the laceration, because you've got two possible explanations for the black eyes. One is the skull fracture I've already mentioned, but that doesn't rule out his getting an impact as well on the front, but there's no way you can separate them.
But as far as around those minor lacerations that you're talking about, you didn't observe or see any record of any bruising or any broken bones in those areas whatsoever?
No, the main one that I was relating to when I spoke about the altercation question was the laceration on the eyelid. That's not related to the head injury that we've been discussing. So it's a separate injury, and it's from some kind of blow to the front.
The minor lacerations that you observe, would they be consistent with being struck by broken pieces of glass or broken pieces of broken sharp pieces of plastic?
If it was indeed a laceration, as it was described, then no, because lacerations by definition, although this is a term that's often misused, by the way, even by some doctors, but a laceration by definition is an open wound caused by blunt force, not sharp.
So blunt force, as far as what I'm asking is it possible that the lacerations to his face were caused by a blunt object that then shattered and caused the lacerations to his face?
I find that hard to imagine. I find that very hard to even conceive of.
So it's not conceivable? Is that what you're saying?
To me, no.
And from your review of whatever reports and medical records and everything else, What, if anything, did you see, or did you see anything that had to do with an animal being present on scene, or an animal being near Mr. O'Keefe's body, or Mr. O'Keefe being inside the house?
I don't know. I mean, but I heard there was an animal somewhere around the place, a dog. I think you mentioned the dog earlier.
So somewhere around the place, but no evidence that you've seen that
That's-
animal interacted with Mr. O'Keefe in any way.
No, I wasn't there, obviously, and all I can say is what I've already said, but I don't know any more than that.
I know you weren't there. What I'm saying is, from the material that you reviewed, was there any indication or any evidence of that animal ever being near, close to, or interacting in any way with Mr. O'Keefe?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
I have nothing further.
Little?
Thank you. Your Honor, if I may approach.
Sure.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Lally?
Dr. Sheridan, if you could just take a look at that photograph. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I saw this photograph before. Yeah.
Could you describe that photograph to the jury?
It shows the decedent's knees taken from the right side, but you can see both knees. Mhm.
Your Honor, permission to mark this and then publish it.
Mark it, put it into evidence. Okay, is there any objection, Mr. Lally?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. That would be exhibit 657. Yes, you may publish it, Ms. Little.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Sheridan, you were asked on cross-examination about an injury to Mr. O'Keefe's knee. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes. Mhm.
Is this the injury that you were testifying about earlier?
Yes, this has been mentioned before. It's an abrasion.
And that's the extent of the injury to Mr. O'Keefe's knee, correct?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, in that area. Yeah.
Thank you. No further questions.
All right. All right, Dr. Sheridan, you are all set, sir.
Very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Step right up and just watch your step for me. You say in the face.
You tell us whether the evidence given to the court and jury in the case now and hearing should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes.
All right, Mr. Jackson, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, could you state your full name and spell your last name for us, please?
Daniel Michael Wolf, last name spelled W-O-L-F-E.
Dr. Wolf, what do you do for a living?
I am the Director of Accident Reconstruction at a company known as ARCA, A-R-C-C-A.
And what is ARCA exactly?
So ARCA is a forensic engineering consulting firm. We have a variety of disciplines that include human factors, biomechanics, crashworthiness, accident reconstruction, just to name a few.
Based on your title, it sounds like you're the director of the entire accident reconstruction format for ARCA, correct?
That is correct.
What sort of contracts does ARCA routinely engage in?
So we do a lot of work in civil litigation. So we work with insurance carriers, law firms, but we also consult with and do projects with the federal government as well as the National Hockey League on player safety. So we're involved in a number of research projects as well.
Is there other clientele that seeks out ARCA for accident reconstruction or biomechanics or human factors issues?
In terms of beyond the parties that I just listed,
You mentioned the U.S. Department of Defense.
yes, the military, yes, the Army.
Tell me a little bit about the work that you've done for the Department of Defense.
Well, that was before my time, but I'm aware of projects that dealt with working on vehicles that were over in the Middle East, where they basically designed energy absorbing seats because there was injuries when the vehicles were going over IEDs.
Is ARCA known both nationally and internationally? Or is it recognized as a leader in accident reconstruction issues?
Yes.
As the director of accident reconstruction at ARCA, do you specialize in both accident reconstruction and the human factors that are associated with such reconstruction where necessary?
Yes.
Can you give me a synopsis of the professional discipline of what is accident reconstruction?
I think a simple definition in my mind would be the application of physics, engineering, science, and mathematics to collision events. I always like to think of it as if you open up a puzzle box and you dump the pieces out and you've got a bunch of pieces and you're trying to piece together the evidence to see how everything fits to get a clear picture.
And what is the application of human factors to that process?
So to give you an example of human factors in the field of accident reconstruction, so I do a lot of nighttime visibility and conspicuity work. So to give you an example of that, let's say a driver's driving down the road at night, there's a pedestrian that's crossing the road. So we want to have an understanding based upon that pedestrian's clothing, the headlights of the vehicle, any potential artificial lighting in the area. When does a driver recognize that individual on the roadway? And then we can also look at literature to have an understanding of how do drivers respond based upon the hazard they're presented with. So there's different response times depending on the hazard. So it's going to be different for a pedestrian crossing the roadway or a driver responding to a vehicle suddenly stopping in front of them.
Dr. Wolf, as an accident reconstructionist, do you investigate and reconstruct both passenger vehicle issues, commercial vehicle issues, motor vehicle, pedestrian issues, all of the above?
Yes, I see all types of accidents.
And how long have you been doing this work with ARCA?
A little over 7 years now.
What education, training, and background qualifies you to perform the duties that you've just described for the jury?
Back in 2012, I received a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from James Madison University, along with a minor in mathematics. Some of my courses while at JMU included courses in physics, statics, dynamics, kinematics, material science, along with your other engineering sciences. Subsequent to my undergraduate degree, I then went on to the University of Delaware to pursue my PhD in electrical and computer engineering with a concentration in electromagnetics and photonics.
What additional training or experience do you have as it relates to accident reconstruction in addition to the formal education and the PhD?
Certainly. So in addition to my undergraduate degree and my PhD, I've continued to take courses through Northwestern University in crash reconstruction. Some of those courses have included human factors, lighting. I've taken courses on electronic vehicle data, photogrammetry, three-dimensional laser scanning. So I've continued to take courses subsequent to graduating.
Do you also hold any accreditations in terms of accident reconstruction?
Yes, I'm accredited by an organization known as ACTAR, which is the Accreditation Commission for Traffic Accident Reconstruction.
Are you trained in photogrammetry?
Yes, sir.
Is that to determine vehicle crash incidents or the circumstances surrounding them based on map scenes, evidence from photographs, things of that nature?
Absolutely. So photogrammetry is the science of extracting information, if you will, out of photographs. So things dimensionally about an object spatially without ever actually physically seeing the object or inspecting it.
So you don't have to be at the scene to effectively and scientifically reconstruct it to your satisfaction.
No, not at all. And quite frankly, to be honest with you, in my world in civil litigation, oftentimes by the time a case comes across my desk, it's, the accident happened 5 years ago. Some I've even had 10 or 15 years ago. So getting access to the vehicle at that point, it's going to be a long shot.
Doctor, are you a member of any professional societies?
Yes.
Describe those, please.
So I'm a member of the Society of Automotive Engineers, SAE. I'm also a member of the National Association for Professional Accident Reconstructionists, the Optical Society of America, and also the Illuminating Engineering Society.
How many cases would you say in your experience in your career have you reconstructed or attempted to reconstruct, you or your team members?
I don't actively track that. If I had to estimate at this point in my career, it'd probably be well over 1,000.
And how many of those 1,000, I know you'd have a number specific, but how many of those 1,000 would you say involved pedestrians as well?
Several hundred. As I mentioned earlier, a great, excuse me, a great deal of my work is in the field of lighting and visibility. So there's a direct correlation between time of day and pedestrian incidents. We see a rise in the evening and night hours just due to drivers having a difficult ability to try to perceive and recognize individuals. So I certainly see a lot of pedestrian collisions in my casework.
You've done testing or research as it relates to the kinematics and the interaction between pedestrians and vehicles.
Absolutely. So we do a number of tests at ARCA to look at the interaction between pedestrians and vehicles. One of the ones I know I did most recently where we were evaluating a vehicle essentially rolling over a pedestrian. So we wanted to understand the vehicle dynamics as well as the interaction between the pedestrian and the road surface. So we conducted testing at ARCA to evaluate that.
Does ARCA have any other disciplines other than just accident reconstruction?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, we have crash worthiness. So again, that's where you're going to be looking at the safety of a vehicle. How does it perform in a crash? We have human factors, failure analysis, premise liability, and biomechanics.
As an accident reconstructionist, doctor, do you or have you studied or tested the forces that are at play between objects interacting, a human being interacting with a vehicle, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely.
Part of what you do.
Yes, sir.
Describe that.
So we use hybrid instrumented dummies at ARCA for our testing. So if we want to have an understanding that an occupant in a vehicle, the forces that they might experience, or for any matter, again, if it's an instance where you have something that ends up falling on someone's head and you want to have an understanding of the forces involved in that, we perform testing with hybrid dummies.
Have you ever authored any peer-reviewed papers in the field of physics?
Yes, sir.
Describe those for me.
So I have a number of papers in the field of lighting and optics. I have a recent publication that deals with Toyota and Lexus vehicle control history records as well.
Is that called Toyota Vehicle Control History, Sudden Braking History Recording Characteristics?
Yes, sir.
All right. Was that specific to dealing with vehicles and their interaction with other vehicles and or pedestrians?
It involved looking at the various triggers that system is capable of recording. And specifically, it was looking at what triggers a sudden braking event. So we were able to determine that those triggers, the sudden braking event is triggered when a driver, or I should say the vehicle,
Objection.
reaches.
May we approach?
Sure.
You are unmuted.
Now you're.
Yes, you
Thank
can
you.
move on.
You've been qualified in other courts to testify as an expert in the area of accident reconstruction. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
You were not hired by the defense in this case, correct?
That is correct.
At the time you did your expert review, Dr. Wolf, and your consultation, you and I had never met.
That's correct.
You did not know who I was.
I did not.
You had never met Ms. Little.
No.
Mr. Unetti.
No,
Matter of fact, you'd never heard of this case.
that's correct.
You were hired by another agency not connected in any way to the defense. Is that right?
Correct.
And not connected in any way to the Commonwealth. Is that right?
Correct.
So your analysis and your conclusions and your opinions are completely independent of the defense and the Commonwealth in this case. Is that right?
Objection.
Sustained. Mr. Jackson, you can ask it differently.
When you did your analysis and conclusions, well, let me ask it this way. You finalized your report, you and your team, correct?
Correct.
That report is contained in a multi-page document that was submitted following your analysis and your opinions and conclusions, right?
Correct.
The defense didn't have anything to do with that, correct?
Correct.
You had never met us. Didn't know who we were when you did this.
Correct.
You'd never met Mr. Lally, didn't know who he was when you did this.
Correct.
So your analysis, opinions, testing, and conclusions were requested by a completely separate agency.
That is correct.
Goes without saying, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. You haven't been paid by the defense,
You have not paid us anything, no.
and you don't work for us.
That's correct.
As a matter of fact, I've never asked you specific questions about your testing before today.
That is correct.
Your work product, the report that you provided, was provided both to the defense as well as the Commonwealth. Is that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
And you were equally available to both sides.
In terms of them reaching out,
Correct.
yes.
And I called you ultimately after receiving your report, asked if you'd join us and testify, correct?
That is correct.
Were you and your team asked to undertake a review for purposes of accident reconstruction of the case that's now pending before the court?
Yes, sir.
Was your team asked to do this by the agency that ultimately retained you, not us?
That's correct.
Who at ARCA was assigned to the team who would ultimately undertake this job of accident reconstruction?
It was myself, Dr. Andrew Rentschler, and Scott Klein.
What was Dr. Rentschler's role in this case as it's distinguished from your role in the case?
Certainly. So Dr. Rentschler is a biomechanical engineer, and ultimately he assessed whether or not there was a mechanism for the injuries of Mr. John O'Keefe.
And what was your focus? If he's talking about the injuries to Mr. O'Keefe, what was your focus in your reconstruction and your analysis?
I would simply say it was looking more at the damage to the vehicle.
Okay, so in terms of your team and the responsibilities of each of the team members, you were more focused on the damage to the SUV. Dr. Rentschler was more focused on the injuries suffered by Mr. O'Keefe, correct?
I think that's a fair characterization, although with the caveat that we worked together as a team. So we weren't isolated kind of in those areas, not speaking to each other. We certainly worked together on the analysis.
Understood. Were you provided or did you review certain materials in furtherance of your consultation in this matter?
Yes.
What were you provided?
We were provided photographs of the incident location. We were provided photographs of the Lexus. There were a couple of incident reports that we received. I could look at my report for the full list, but those
So
are the ones.
You can go ahead and do that, Doctor.
Do you have the report with you?
Yes, sir.
I have a copy of it. Is this faster?
Sure. If you,
May I?
Sure.
thank you.
How many categories of materials were you provided?
Provided it would be approximately 10.
Could you list those off for the jurors, please?
It would be the Norfolk SPDU homicide death report, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of State Police crime scene report, OCME dispatch removal report, photographs of the incident location, videos of the incident location, photographs of the 2021 Lexus LX 570, photographs of recovered evidence, crash data retrieval report from the 2021 Lexus 570, report of autopsy, and autopsy photographs.
Based on these data that you were provided, were you able to satisfactorily, to your mind, satisfactorily engage in the consultation that you were hired to do
Yes.
and come up with some opinions and conclusions based on scientific certainty?
Yes.
Did you review scene photographs of the alleged incident?
Yes, sir.
What information were you able to glean or gather from your review of the photographs, from the scene specifically?
So from those photographs, I was able to identify there was fragments of transparent red, clear plastic. There also appeared to be pieces of chrome and black plastic. I also observed what appeared to be glass fragments along with a black drinking straw.
Did you also review some videos?
Yes.
That was out at the scene, maybe a leaf blower?
Correct. It appeared to be daytime, yes.
Okay. What did you note about the photography at the scene of the items that were being photographed?
Well, I think one thing that comes to mind is it was a little bit difficult to follow the evidence, so to speak. So typically, when I go out and do an inspection, especially of a fresh incident, let's say I've got a debris field or I've got tire marks, what I like to do is kind of step into the scene, if you will, where you take global perspective shots and then you step into a specific piece of evidence so that you can, at a later point in time, identify where that evidence is. I noted that in a lot of these photographs, I didn't see a whole lot of that stepping in. It was essentially just zoomed right into where that evidence is, but not really having a great understanding of where was it relative to all of the other evidence.
Or when it got there.
Correct.
Based on your review of all the materials that you described for the court, did you get an understanding of what the Commonwealth's theory of the case is, specifically that Mr. O'Keefe was struck by the Lexus SUV?
Objection.
Sustained.
Did you come to understand that the allegations before the court were that Mr. O'Keefe was struck by the vehicle?
Objection.
Sustained. Ask it differently, Mr. Jackson.
Did you perform an accident reconstruction specifically focused on determining whether or not damage to the Lexus was consistent with hitting Mr. O'Keefe? Also focused on whether or not the injuries to Mr. O'Keefe were the result of being hit by a vehicle?
Yes.
Okay. During your analysis, did you note the damage to the vehicle?
Yes, sir.
Describe that, please.
So the primary damage was to the right taillight. It appeared to be fractured with the majority of the lens cover, so that clear and red plastic covering missing from it. In addition to that, if you're looking at the back of the vehicle, to the left of that, in the area above there's also another tail lamp assembly on the lift gate. So above that assembly, there was a small dent along with some paint chips on the bumper, more so on the wraparound section as it kind of curves around to the right side of the vehicle. There appeared to be some superficial scratches as well in that area.
Was there any other damage or deformation that you were able to glean from your review, the photogrammetry, damage to the Lexus, the bumpers, the panels, the quarter panel, the sheet metal, anything like that?
No, the rest was remarkably intact.
Is it common in vehicle pedestrian collisions that there is some sort of bumper displacement and or sheet metal deformation that's concomitant to that?
Absolutely. Assuming a pedestrian is positioned in a normal upright position, you certainly would expect to see damage to the bumper. In a lot of cases, what happens is, the bumper is just clipped on. So again, the force of that impact will oftentimes cause the bumper to kind of become unmounted or unclipped. You certainly could see deformation to body paneling, such as the lift gate or the quarter panel as well.
Is that especially true at higher speeds, meaning above 15 miles per hour or so?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Was there any apparent damage to the Lexus that appeared consistent with any kind of pedestrian interaction that you saw?
No, it was really confined to just the taillight, a very isolated portion of the vehicle.
During your review and your investigation, did you note information concerning items that were supposedly found on the bumper?
Yes.
What was that?
I believe it was noted there was 2 apparent glass fragments located on the top bumper cover.
What's the significance of the presence of those items or the lack of materiality of those items in your view?
Well, again, I think this, going back to the scene evidence, again, we knew that there was glass fragments, what appeared to be from a drinking glass, at the scene of the alleged incident.
Is there any glass consistent with the glass that was supposedly found on the bumper, in the taillight housing, the taillight mechanism, anything from the car, from the Lexus, that would account for that glass?
Okay, I think I understand. So the taillight itself is not comprised of any glass. It is all plastic. So that damage, or I should say that glass on the top bumper cover could not have come from the right taillight.
Now, based on your review of the information that was provided to you, did you undertake any testing of that vehicle? I'm sorry, any testing concerning the damage to the vehicle?
Yes, sir.
All right, can you describe what that testing was.
So we performed, again, this is with Dr. Rentschler and I working together on this again. We performed projectile testing to the tail lamp with a drinking glass as well as a hybrid head form.
Let's take those one at a time. How would you describe the drinking glass test?
Certainly. So again, from our review of the evidence, we knew that we had an isolated portion of damage to Lexus confined to the taillight. So we know that we're dealing with potentially a small object that could have created that. Looking at, again, the evidence in terms of the scene photographs, we know that we have a damaged drinking glass at the scene in the vicinity of the fragments of the taillight. So the theory that Dr. Rentschler and I put forward is potentially an individual threw this drinking glass at the back of the Lexus, causing the taillight to fracture.
I'm going to interrupt you right there. You and Dr. Rentschler formed that theory and wanted to test that theory, correct?
Yes,
You were not told that theory by the defense because you've never met us.
correct,
You were not told that theory by the Commonwealth. You never met them, correct?
correct.
Your theory was the product of simply having some facts extant in the data. You got a broken drinking glass, a broken taillight. Let's put them together and figure out if the drinking glass could be responsible for the taillight and vice versa.
Absolutely, yes.
And that was your determination of, well, we were given instructions to reconstruct this. Let's look at every single angle, correct?
Absolutely. And I will note, as part of the engagement with the entity that retained us, we were asked not to do any outside research or investigation of the case. It was to be based solely on the evidence that we were provided.
Okay. As a matter of fact, and importantly, while you were doing your testing, had you ever even heard of the Karen Reed case?
No.
So getting back to that testing, and I interrupted your flow, you were looking at whether or not the glass could have produced the damage to the rear taillight that you saw, correct?
Correct.
And what did you do in furtherance of making a determination about whether or not that was possible?
Certainly. So myself and one of our lab technicians at ARCA, we designed and developed a pressurized air cannon. So it was capable of firing a projectile such as a drinking glass at the taillight. So it essentially, you can think of it kind of as a giant cannon, but it had a barrel, and then there was a valve that would open rapidly, and directly behind that was a pressurized vessel. And depending on the pressure, the PSI of that vessel, would determine essentially the speed at which that glass would be projected into the taillight.
So you literally built a cannon?
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Pretty cool job. Tell me what the results of your testing was with this pneumatic cannon that would fire.
We performed 2 different tests in terms of speeds. The target speeds were 30 and 40 miles per hour.
Why was that?
Well, so with consultation with Dr. Rentschler, he indicated that that is a reasonable speed at which an adult male or an individual, for that matter, could throw a drinking glass at the taillight.
Had anybody up to that point, anybody told you any specific, let me see if I can rephrase that. Had anybody indicated that there was any evidence whatsoever that John O'Keefe had thrown a drinking glass at the taillight?
No.
Was this another example of you and Dr. Rentschler and your team just exploring sort of every possibility and working a little bit in the blind?
Objection.
Sustained.
What was the reason that you decided, or you and your team decided, that you wanted to approximate how a grown man could throw a glass at a taillight?
Well, I think we wanted to have an understanding is when a projectile such as a drinking glass interacted with the taillight, would we get damage on the test taillight that was consistent with that of the subject taillight?
Understood. So based on your theory, were you able to approximate the damage on the taillight?
Yes.
Describe that for us.
So as I mentioned, we ran 2 tests. The target speeds were at 30 and 40 miles per hour. And there was a little bit of variability in terms of what our target was and what we actually achieved. So the achieved speeds were at 31 miles per hour and 37 miles per hour. So there's just, depending on how the glass leaves the barrel and some of the rotation can affect some of the speed, or ultimately the end result speed to that. So What I will say, though, is that with the 37 mile per hour projectile into the taillight, we noted and observed that there was damage that was consistent with that of the subject tail lamp, and that the test tail lamp had the majority of the outer lens fractured and missing, broken into pieces, as well as some underlying damage to some of the internal components as well.
Are you saying, well, let me ask a different question. You were able to replicate the damage to the taillight using a pneumatic cannon firing a glass at 37 miles an hour directly at the taillight, correct?
Correct.
All right. And that would also shatter the glass too, correct?
Correct.
Did you do any testing about whether or not that damage to the taillight could be produced by a person simply holding a glass and being hit by the car driving in reverse?
We didn't do any testing of that, and primarily because, again, if we're looking at the arm and its total length, right? We only have a narrow damage pattern, which on the taillight, if you think about where where it meets the lift gate into where it starts to wrap around to the side of the vehicle, that's only about 6.5 inches in width.
All right. When you fired the glass into the taillight was static. In other words, it was not going to move. It was immovable at that point, correct?
Correct.
All right. So the glass is hurling through the air at 37 miles an hour and hits a static object that's resisting. And that smash is what produced ultimately the taillight damage that you were able to replicate. Is that right?
Yes.
If a person were holding in his hand the glass and the taillight were to hit that hand, the hand would not remain static, correct?
Objection.
Sustained. Ask it differently, Mr. Jackson.
If the taillight were to make contact with a person holding a glass, would that replicate what you did in terms of you're firing a glass into the taillight? In other words, are they apples and apples?
No, I don't think it would be the same.
Okay. Why is that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, again, the damage to the back of the Lexus, again, is confined to just that roughly, again, when we're talking about the taillight itself, that 6.5 inch section in width.
Right.
So it's inconsistent with the total length of the arm, and certainly from discussion with Dr. Rentschler, inconsistent with the injuries to the arm.
So given everything in your investigation revealed concerning this testing, are you saying that the taillight was damaged by John O'Keefe holding a drinking glass that was hit by an SUV?
Objection.
Sustained.
In all the information that you provided, you were not provided anything that suggested that John O'Keefe threw a glass at the taillight. Correct?
Objection.
Sustained.
Their approach.
Yeah, it's just, yes.
You are unmuted.
May I?
Yes.
Thank you. What information, if any, were you provided that suggested that John O'Keefe threw a glass at the taillight?
No information.
What information, if any, were you provided that suggested that John O'Keefe may have had a pneumatic cannon with him that night?
I'm not aware of any information regarding that.
All right. You also did some testing concerning a drop test. Is that right?
Correct.
Tell us about that drop test testing.
Certainly. So Again, through discussion with Dr. Rentschler, it was my understanding that Mr. O'Keefe had a skull fracture on the back of his head. So we wanted to do an evaluation of the interaction between the back of a head. In this case, we used again, talking about that instrumented dummy again, we used the instrumented hybrid head form to perform a drop test to evaluate the forces of an interaction between a tail light from the Lexus and the human head.
What height did you choose to perform this drop test?
7.5 feet.
Why'd you choose that height?
Well, if you calculate it through physics and the acceleration due to gravity, that would equate to an impact speed of 15 miles per hour at that height.
And what was the significance of 15 miles per hour?
Well, that was essentially kind of a starting point for us, if you will. So I will tell you that in reverse, 15 miles an hour is fast. I don't know if you've ever looked at your speedometer when you're pulling into your driveway, reversing into a parking stall. Most people probably don't go more than 5 miles an hour or so. So 15 miles an hour in reverse is fast, especially when we're talking about, it's my understanding it was nighttime. There was winter conditions, potentially wet or icy roads. So again, that speed is going to be what I would say on the high end for going in reverse. So also in addition to with respect to kind of just the nature of that speed, it's my understanding through discussion with Dr. Rentschler that at 15 miles an hour, you start to see significant injuries to the human body when it makes contact with a vehicle. And I think one last point is that we needed to pick a speed where, again, this is kind of just us brainstorming, where we would have damage to the taillight, right? It would fracture it, but it wouldn't completely obliterate it. So we knew if we chose a speed, for instance, of 40 miles an hour, we know we're going to completely essentially explode the taillight. But if we do, 1 mile an hour, we may not do anything to it, right? So we kind of had to pick a middle ground to again, cause damage to the taillight.
What was your conclusion with following that testing? What was your conclusion with regard to whether or not it was consistent or inconsistent with the damage to the truck and the taillight was consistent or inconsistent with making contact with John O'Keefe's head at or above 15 miles an hour?
So strictly speaking to a damage perspective, the 15 mile an hour interaction between the hybrid head form and the test tail lamp produced significantly more damage than that of the subject vehicle. So that indicates that, again, the damage on the subject tail light was less than that of the test tail light.
So if I were to ask you whether or not there would be more or less damage to the taillight if you increase the speed to 24 miles an hour, what is your conclusion?
Well, you're talking about significantly more kinetic energy. So if you just think about it from, again, a kinetic energy standpoint, kinetic energy is equal to 1/2 times the mass and the velocity squared. So if you're squaring that velocity and you're going from 15 up to 24 miles per hour, you're going to get a significant amount of more energy associated with that. Probably, I could pull up my calculator, but you're probably looking at 2.5 more times energy than the 15 mile an hour test.
Which means 2.5 more times the damage to the taillight,
Certainly.
which you did not see in your review of the materials, correct?
Correct.
So what is your opinion or conclusion as to whether or not the damage to the taillight was caused by striking John O'Keefe's head?
From a damage standpoint, it was inconsistent.
I want to shift gears back to the injuries that you saw concerning Mr. O'Keefe's arm, his right arm. During the course of your investigation, did you look at photographs and investigate the injuries to his right arm?
Yes, sir.
What's the width of the taillight, specifically from where it meets the lift gate to the left side? I'm sorry, to the side of the vehicle, the right side of the vehicle.
To the right. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, that is about 6.5 inches. It starts to wrap around to the right side. So really it's, even though the taillight continues, it's not projecting out on the back end more. It's again, wrapping around. So in terms of the width that is facing the rear, if you will, it's about 6.5 inches.
And you noted that there was a dent and some paint chips that you identified above the lift gate, correct?
Correct.
How far away from the right side of the vehicle were those scratches and that dent?
Approximately 20 inches.
What was the significance of that distance?
Well, again, to go back to your question about, I think if somebody was holding a drinking glass, right, and their arm was extended to cause that damage, or if it's theorized that those dents and chips were from that. Again, the thing that sticks out to me is that you have essentially the Lexus taillight.
So ask another question.
What's the significance of whether or not there was damage between the dent and the tail light? In other words, that 20-inch area. Was it dented? Was it harmed in any way?
So in terms of, again, if we're talking about, again, looking at the back of the vehicle and we go to kind of where that right tail lamp just meets the lift gate, as I mentioned, there's another lamp assembly on the lift gate itself. There's also a chrome trim piece above that, and then certainly the body paneling to the lift gate itself. And I think what stood out to me is that between that dent and the fractured taillight, there was no observable damage to that area, which I would have expected had an arm been positioned there.
Can you calculate, or could you calculate, or did you calculate the amount of force that would be required to strike a person just only on the outstretched portion of his arm in order to project him a number of feet, for instance, 30 feet in one direction or another?
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Objection.
Take a distance out of it. Break it down.
I'll ask you the same question, but without the 30 feet.
Okay.
Were you able to calculate, or could you calculate the force that would be required to strike a person on his outstretched arm hard enough to spin him around and project him a number of feet?
If you're talking about only an interaction between the arm and the back of the vehicle, no, there wouldn't be any projection. Again, if you think about this, the arm weighs about, again, with Mr. O'Keefe would be about 11 pounds. So you still have, another 200 plus pounds being held down by gravity, and the force is only acting on the arm. So essentially the arm would be accelerated, but the whole body, because the center of mass is not being struck, would not be projected.
Is the absence of the damage that you described, the absence of damage that you described between the dent and the rest of the vehicle, with the exception of the taillight, is that consistent or inconsistent with striking an outstretched arm of a human being?
Objection.
I'll allow that.
That would be inconsistent, in my opinion.
They have just a moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
And what is your opinion, Doctor, as to the amount of damage that you would expect to see at 15 miles per hour or above on the taillight if, in fact, that vehicle were moving in reverse and were to strike something on a human body, for instance, an elbow or an arm?
Objection.
I'll allow that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Probably not.
Sorry.
I'm trying. Physics, that's why. From your testing, what would you expect to see in terms of the damage to the right rear tail light, if in fact that tail light were to make contact with a part of a human body, for instance, an elbow or an arm, at 15 miles an hour or above? What would the level of damage be as compared to the damage that you actually saw?
Well, if we compare it to, again, looking at the drop test that we did with the hybrid head, which weighs about 10 pounds. So again, if we're talking about now a human arm that's comparable in that same weight, we certainly would expect to see a comparable level of force and damage. So as I mentioned, if the arm is outstretched across the right tail lamp and into the liftgate section, I would certainly expect to see deformation to that body paneling, even potentially the tail light on the liftgate itself and that chrome piece as well.
Based on the entirety of your investigation, your entire team's investigation, all the testing that you did, all the biomechanical testing and the engineering and the physics testing that you did, in your expert opinion, Was that taillight damaged by striking John O'Keefe on the head?
Objection.
Sustained.
In your opinion, was the taillight damaged by either striking Mr. O'Keefe on the head or the arm?
Objection.
Sustained.
Can we approach?
Yes.
You are muted. You are unmuted.
May I, Your Honor?
Yes.
Last question, Doctor. In your expert opinion, based on all your testing, is the damage to the taillight that you saw consistent with striking a human head?
No.
In your expert opinion, is the damage to the taillight consistent with striking a human arm?
No.
Thank you. That's all I have.
All right, jurors, we will take our morning recess.
All rise for the court, please.
You are muted.